So let's take a look at ferns. So here's a nice picture. It shows some of the features of ferns. The sporophyte is the dominant stage, and these are mostly leaves. Typically when you see a fern, you see leaves. The roots are usually under the ground. Sometimes they creep along horizontally with a horizontal stem called a rhizome. Sometimes the rhizome is vertical, and they form in a circle. The undersurface of many ferns have clusters of sporangia. So you can see these visibly. They're sometimes about the size of, a grain of rice or a pencil eraser. But they are many, many sporangia, many, many spore cases clustered together. That's called a sorus. And the individual units are sporangia, which in many ferns look like the ones shown here. They kind of remind me of Tootsie Roll Pops. They're sort of globular with sort of a band, a little belt around the circumference, which is called the annulus, and it splits open and releases the spores, kind of hurls them. And these are really small, hand lens visible, and I'll show you some pictures. So here's some facts about ferns. They're mostly to show the leaf of the sporophyte. They're sometimes called fronds. A frond is just a name for an elaborate leaf. The way that most ferns are, they're curled up when they're buds, and they kind of look like fiddleheads. I'll show you a picture of that. They're mostly homosporous. Again, details to follow, but it's basically they produce one type of spore, and it germinates to form a gametophyte that has both antheridia and archegonia. They often are clustered, the sporangia are often clustered together and covered with a little flap of tissue called an indusium. This will help us identify ferns. There's some differences in the shapes of these sori and the indusia. And the gametophyte, as we've seen, small, flat, dorsiventral, heart-shaped. Sometimes it's called a prothallus. It's kind of a weird word. Pro means coming before, and thallus is a name for an undifferentiated plant without a lot of structural details. And as in all non-seed plants, I like this theme. Sperm have to swim through environmental water in order to reach the egg, unlike seed plants where the sperm travels in a pollen grain. And an example is a wood fern, like marginal wood fern. So here's a picture of a fern leaf, and here, see how this leaf is curled up? That's what's called a fiddlehead. Here's a more elaborate and aesthetically engaging picture of a fiddlehead. It's a fern bud. It's curled up. It's kind of a fern characteristic. People like to use the word fiddlehead because it looks like part of a musical instrument. So let's take a look at the spore-producing parts of these sporophytes. And this is a fern that has its sporophyte leaf is divided in two portions. A lower portion which has pretty nice, well-developed leaves, and the upper portion looks sort of shriveled. This is a fern that's what's called hemidimorphic. I used to use the word heteromorphic, but I don't anymore. And this is called Christmas fern. Let's take a look at the undersurface of those upper leaflets, those smaller ones. And see, these little circular structures are the sori. And what there are is a flap of tissue, kind of like an umbrella-shaped flap of tissue in this case, that's called the indusium. And these little grains that are underneath it and peeking out, those are the sporangia. They're kind of small. This, seen right near that same fern, or one like it, same species, is a fern gametophyte with young sporophytes. So this portion here is the gametophyte, and then here's a young sporophyte growing out of it. So here is the gametophyte, and this is the leaves of the sporophyte. And these are, again, about the size of a fingernail. It's growing beneath the adult, mature sporophytes. And this is what fern gametophytes look like. Here's some young leaves of Christmas fern unfurling. So let's take a look at some fern sporophytes and see where the spores are being produced. So here's many ferns have what's called a monomorphic frond type. That means that the leaves that bear spores don't look any different than the ones that don't, except that they happen to have sporangia on the undersurfaces of them. So here's a fern, the upper surface, and here's the lower surface. And each one of these little eyelash markings, like there's about 8 of them or 10 of them on each little leaflet. Each one of those is a sorus, and it's covered partly by a flap of tissue called the indusium. And the shape of these are distinctive. Here's a fern that is, it's divided into 2 parts. The lower part is vegetative and does photosynthesis, and the upper part that looks kind of shriveled and withered is the spore-producing part. It's producing many sort of globular sporangia. So this is one leaf that's divided into 2 parts. This is a hemidimorphic frond type, divided into 2 parts, a photosynthetic part and a spore-bearing part. This is a close-up of the sporangia. This is called grape fern or rattlesnake fern, and it's really big sporangia. It's a member of a group of ferns types that have what are called eusporangiate ferns with big sporangia. Here they are when they're young, and here they are when they're older, and you can see they're split open and they've released their spores. Some of them anyway. This is a fern that is holodimorphic. That is to say, they have separate leaves that are completely and entirely photosynthetic, not producing spores, these pretty looking leafy ones. And then other leaves, these ones that look sort of shriveled and withered somehow, they are fully and completely modified for producing spores. Separate leaves, some that are vegetative, some that are spore producing entirely. And this is a fern that kind of looks like cinnamon sticks, so it's called cinnamon fern. So here's a picture showing on the left. We can see close up the leaves that are bearing spores, and then focusing on a different leaf, the ones that are completely vegetative and not producing spores. It's called a fertile frond and a sterile frond. Here's a close-up of the fertile frond. These are really big sporangia. These are much bigger than found in many other ferns. And I guess they're on the undersurface of leaflets, but they're so modified that you really can't make that distinction. So here's a kind of a fern called a wood fern. And if you look at the undersurface, you can see sori. This entire structure shows part of a leaf. And this is a leaflet. These little sub-leaflets. And each sub-leaflet has, about 8 or 10 or 12 sori, which are aggregations of dozens of sporangia covered when they're young by a little flap of tissue. And here we have a close-up of that wood fern. And what we see is, here we see in the center, a little sort of heart-shaped, kidney bean-shaped indusium, a little flap of tissue, and then these aggregated little globes that are peeking out. Those are the sporangia. And so this picture shows 6 sori, 7 I guess, with a kidney-shaped indusium and dozens of globular sporangia. Here's a fern that's common on rocks in southern Ohio. And here, the light showing through, we can see the sori. And this particular fern is kind of unusual in that it doesn't have that flap of tissue. It doesn't have an indusium. These are naked sori. They're pretty large. And here we see a lot of sporangia that have released their spores. They kind of look cracked open and sort of light colored. Here's another type of a fern. Let's look at the undersurface. And look at all those sori all kind of aggregated together towards the midvein. What we should be seeing here is that the shapes of the spore-producing parts of the leaves are distinctive enough to be useful in identification. Another thing about ferns is that their leaves sometimes are very lacy and divided in what you'd think of as being fern-like, and other times, other species, they're not so divided. So here's a type of a frond that has entire leaves without any lobing even. Here's the undersurface of that, showing these sort of disorganized linear indusia, another distinctive feature. Here's a fern that has leaves that are fully and completely divided up into leaflets. And there's the undersurface showing the linear indusia, or sori. I use those terms interchangeably because it's the shape that's important, and they're the same. Here's a plant that's got leaves that are divided into leaflets, and the leaflets are divided almost all the way into subleaflets, but not quite completely. And here's the undersurface showing sori, aggregations of sporangia on the undersurface of the leaves. Here's a leaf that's very, very lacy. It's divided up into leaflets that are fully and completely divided up into subleaflets that are fully and completely divided up into sub-leaflets. It's called Sanded Fern. And here's the undersurface of it, showing the sori, where the spores are produced. Here's one that's simply divided up into leaflets. And there's the undersurface, showing these linear sori, about dozens of them. Here's one that's got a sort of beautiful contoured shape to it. It's called Maidenhair Fern, and it's kind of hard to describe exactly how it's divided, but it's distinctive enough that you don't have to go to great pains to come up with the terminology. And look at the undersurface of these leaves. Instead of having sort of dots that are the sori, instead the sporangia are produced at the margins of the leaves, sort of scalloped leaf margins. And instead of having a separate flap of tissue that's devoted to covering up the spores when they're developing, the margin of the leaf is curled under and sort of acts like an indusium. It's called a false indusium because it's not a true separate flap of tissue, but it's just the margin of the leaf that's functioning as an indusium. Here's a beautiful plant growing on a sandstone ledge. It's called mountain spleen wart. And there's the undersurface showing the spore-producing parts of mountain spleen wart. Ferns reproduce, well, actually all plants reproduce by producing spores. There's some confusion about that in common parlance, and it's because many plants, their principal way of multiplication and dispersal is to produce great numbers of spores that go considerable distances and can spread, and that is the way that non-seed plants disseminate and multiply. Some plants, and in this case ferns, reproduce also asexually, and this is one of the ferns that does. So if we look at the undersurface of this bulblet-bearing bladder fern, we see what we expect to see, little sori, little fruit dots, little aggregations. Each one of these leaflets has about, a dozen. But we also see these large sort of pea-sized and shaped, sort of lentil-shaped, what are called bulblets. These are asexual reproductive structures. It takes a lot of energy to make these, and they don't travel very far, but what they're good for, these bulblets, is for making new ferns in an environment that's obviously ideal for this kind of fern to grow, because this kind of fern is growing there. So it can spread in place by these bulblets, whereas the spores are good for moving to new places. So this fern, like some other plants, including, as we will see, some mosses, reproduce both sexually and asexually, and the different types of propagules seem to have a different ecological utility. This is the undersurface of that, showing the sori. And here's another picture showing the bulblets. So this is one of my favorite places. And what this is the home of a very special fern. And it's called the Appalachian Gametophyte, Viteria appalachiana. So this is sort of one of those rock house, grotto, kind of a cave-like situation. And if you were to go in deep into that little recess where it's very, very shady and use a flashlight, this is what it would look like looking out. And you would see this plant. This is the gametophyte of a fern called Viteria appalachiana, a fern that, sadly, I guess, lost its sporophyte. It only reproduces as a gametophyte. Let's take a little field trip and see the Appalachian gametophyte.